Now, what's important, too, is the legal issues. And a lot of people have been asking, what happens to all these legal issues? Remember, the big part of the campaign was he's a convicted felon, and what's interesting is let's go right to that case. So we talked a little about the federal cases. We'll do that again in a minute. But the state cases. So let's go to Harry Hutchinson. And Harry, let's start with a case that's got trial dates on the calendar very soon, and that is the case out of New York involving that one involves whether or not, again, you've got did President Trump basically, I think the next one in New York, is that the Mershon case, right?
It's the Mershon. So this is where he was convicted of the felony counts where
right.
the
kind of felony counts.
Exactly.
Right? The business dealing. So you remember saying you were inflating the numbers to get the loans, and somehow that is criminal. What do we think is going to happen in that case? Because there's an upcoming hearing in that.
I think there's a hearing either this week or next week. And as I recall, Judge Mershon has set a sentencing date toward the end of November. My own intuition says those cases will arguably be paused, if not dismissed, in part because Donald Trump is now the president-elect. And if he were sentenced to some form of prison, he probably would be entitled to an immediate appeal, or at least he would post bond pending appeal. So I'm not convinced that particular case is going anywhere. There is also a case involving 34 counts brought by the Manhattan District Attorney, alleging essentially that Donald Trump violated New York law. How? Because he engaged in illegal federal campaign violations. And I'm not necessarily sure of the status of that particular case. But the two quintessential cases that are before us today involve Jack Smith, who basically has sought to bring a charge, number one, claiming that Donald Trump has violated essentially the federal laws governing the handling of documents. That's in Florida, and then has engaged in election interference in violation of the law, and he's brought that particular case in Washington, D.C., before Judge Chutkan. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the Justice Department policy prevents the Justice Department from essentially attempting to imprison or bring charges against a sitting U.S. president. Neither case that is pending, in other words, the two cases brought by Jack Smith, are likely to be ready for trial before sometime next year at the earliest. So more likely than not, those two cases will be wound down. So if you look at this, we basically have had a kaleidoscope of cases brought against Trump, and they were all designed to do what? To prevent him from running from office. Meanwhile, bringing all of these legal cases has backfired. It has made Donald Trump stronger, and hence he won an overwhelming victory a few days ago.
So, Will, on Tuesday, Judge Mershon has set a date. Really, this is for him to decide whether or not the conviction should be tossed at this point.
Right.
And there's a lot of discussion that he may dismiss the felony counts. So that whole idea that, he's a convicted felon of 34 counts, that goes out the window. Those were controversial to begin with because of the issues we just talked about with Harry. And again, I don't think we have to get bogged down in this. If this moves the way it is looking like it will move, that maybe he tries to keep the misdemeanors. Of course, you can appeal those, and President Trump's team can appeal those, but that doesn't really put any kind of delay or harm on the president from being able to move forward with the transition and his administration. It also would, all of these moves really pull a plug, Harry, on the kind of any attempts by congressional Democrats to say, well, he's a convicted felon, and thus, under some 14th Amendment issue, because we're not even going to get to those cases. So on insurrection, all of that, first of all, Jack Smith really didn't bring those charges technically. But second, the idea that there's even felony counts out that may be done as well, which should make the transition for President Trump a little bit easier when they are certifying the election on Capitol Hill.
Your analysis is precisely correct. And keep in mind that Jeremy Raskin, a representative from Maryland who has threatened to bring charges within the meaning of the 14th Amendment, thus disqualifying President Trump from taking office, he may be bereft of any power to do so. Number one, because more likely than not, the Republicans will retain control of the House of Representatives. But number two, there will be no basis within the meaning of the 14th Amendment to deprive President Trump of the opportunity to take office either. So I think at the end of the day, the 14th Amendment disqualification claims should likely disappear, but we should never underestimate the willingness of Democrats to try to stretch the law, to try to stretch the Constitution to go after President Donald Trump.
Yeah. I mean, so you've got, again, I think you're going to see action, obviously, on the federal side. What's interesting, too, Will, is that you've got, of course, Tuesday, we filed in cases at the 11th Circuit, the one to question whether or not the special counsel should even be constitutional. I don't think we're going to get a final decision on that now, but we filed, and we would be ready to fight that battle in the future if that is tried to be utilized and weaponized again against President Trump, who ultimately has the authority to fire those special counsels, and said, you know what, to Jack Smith, and made it clear he's going to be fired one way or another. Those cases are not going to be moving forward. And I think Jack Smith hopefully will do the right thing, not even put the new president into that position, and knows that under the policies you got to withdraw. And then out of New York, I mean, Letitia James is talking tough, but those are civil cases. I mean, so right. Yes, it's a big bond that President Trump had to put up, but ultimately, again, they really have little impact on running the country or this whole idea that he's a felon. That I think those are going to get tossed aside hopefully next week. And the other charges there on the misdemeanor counts probably can be appealed because those are very weak. And then you look at the felony counts. I think Letitia James can say whatever she wants about being tough on Donald Trump, and they're going to still be this somehow basically keep suing him in state court for civil issues, I guess, that, again, as we've seen from President Trump, he's somebody that's not going to be distracted by that. And
people also shouldn't forget the RICO case in Georgia, where Fani Willis was not taken off of it. But there will be there was oral argument in the appeals court in Georgia whether or not to keep her on, and we should expect a ruling by them sometime early next year. I have a feeling, especially with the political temperature, that they will dismiss her from the case, which that case will go away as well. But one more thing about Jack Smith before we move on in the next segment is that case down in Florida, the one that we just filed in, that's one I think the Department of Justice doesn't have to get out of to some degree, but really wants to, because it's already been tossed, the case against Trump. Right. What they're appealing is whether or not that Jack Smith, a special counsel, could stay on. Since it's only a lower court ruling in one district in the United States, I think the DOJ, for policy purposes, would rather get out of that as soon as possible so that they don't have now an appeals court ruling potentially saying that special counsels are unconstitutional. I think that they want to try to preserve that power, and they're in kind of a tricky spot right now.